Hey, it's great to see you. So what we're going to do this morning is we're going to finish up this series that we started way back on that first Sunday in October. This is the longest series we've done in a bit, although I was flattered to even hear after the first service someone come up to me and was like, I'm so bummed the series is over. So that's flattering because I always when I get bored with myself, I feel like that's a bad sign. But what we're doing in this series is we've been trying to ask this question of 10 years later, what matters? And having come upon our 10-year anniversary of being a church together, we tried to really trying to be honest about the reality that faith changes over time and trying to admit that sometimes that's a good thing and sometimes that's a bad thing and sometimes it's just a thing. And quite frankly, the reality of an evolving faith creates a lot of responsibility on us individually as a community. It only further emphasizes the need for healthy disciplines and relationships and places where we can be challenged and all those different things to just do the hard work of trying to understand what it means to follow God in our context and in our day. And if you're someone that's not there yet, my hope is that this series has at least given permission to explore maybe some of the things that created the off-ramps for you a bit ago, and maybe there's a sense of like, that off-ramp doesn't have to exist. That's maybe a false off-ramp. So what we did the last couple weeks, and we're going to do one more time this week, was begin to speak to this idea of, okay, so having done the work, and I hope you've done your own Evernote work, your own journal work, your own 5 years later or 10 years later or since the divorce or since we got married or since we had our second kid or whatever, what matters. What we want to do this morning is continue in this okay, but we want to hold on to this. I mean, a couple weeks ago we talked about this, that Jesus is a raving fan of character and has the audacity to think that he's better than anybody else at creating it in us. And then last week we talked about the value of questions and mystery and wonder and staying small in relationship. This morning the question I want to ask, and really what I want to do is take two questions and weld them together. So by themselves I think they're really boring. Together I think we really get at some of what we heard Andy in that video speaking to in particular, of this idea of what does it mean to begin to take responsibility for our own needs when it comes to relationships. So the first question I want to ask is this question of what if we learn almost everything relationally? Which is a way of saying that what if real transformation, as much as I value books, as much as you probably value books, as much as we like podcasts and YouTube videos and all those different things, what if to really be transformed, it's likely that what that's going to require is someone who can put skin on that idea and those values. We could think of it this way. How many of you would say that you're a hoarder? That's actually the wrong question. How many of you are with a hoarder? Let's do it that way. See, I've just created a reason for conversation after church. How many of you are like the opposite of a hoarder? Like whatever the opposite of a hoarder is, that's you. See, it turns out you don't even have to put your hand down, right? It's the same group of people. And now I'm very much with you. There's that hobby store. What is that? Hobby Lobby? I loathe that place. And it has nothing to do with them or their values or anything, but I have to get meds before I even walk into that place because it's just, whatever the opposite of a hoarder is, that's me. Or Ross, oh my goodness. I think that you could just fill the parking lot full of people and say, who's excited to go into Ross? And you'll know who the hoarders are and who they're not. And I don't mean to be judgmental, but seriously. But what's weird about that to me, because my kids will get therapy someday for my propensity to throw otherwise useful things away, because my stance is if you haven't used it in 6 months, it's garbage, period. But then what's funny about that to me is when I go back and visit my dad in Billings, I'm quickly reminded that for whatever reason, I'm an anti-hoarder. He's a hoarder. Like in the worst possible sense of maybe not the worst. And this is all stuff we've talked about face to face. So I'm not just talking about him, but I'm not like in the newspaper stacked up to the ceiling sense, but in the sense of, so he has many rental properties and he tends to buy older homes with detached garages. But when you rent a house from him, guess what you don't get? You don't get the garage, because he's got to have a place for his stuff. So I've been teasing, last time we were there, this just occurred to me, I was like, you could start a retreat center or like a therapy center, because people like me would pay you money if you just drop off one of those city giant dumpster things and just, we all need retreats and these different ways of getting away. We would pay you money if you would just leave and let us indiscriminately throw stuff away for a couple days. It would be amazing. A few weeks ago, we went to a Sleepy Rooster session, and it was my wife and I, and then my dad and my stepmom were in town, and a couple of the boys were able to go along as well. And I don't know if you went, it was awesome. And Paul and Jared hosted it at the Oddfellow, and they did hospitality very, very well. They had pretzels and peanuts and all these different things that one could have for free to eat. And I had 2 middle school boys with me. You know how this goes is they would get a bowl of pretzels, and then they would eat about half of them, and then they'd put them under the seat in front of them, and then they'd go get another bowl of pretzels or peanuts, and they'd eat some of them, and then they'd go, and I started to see out of the corner of my eye, my dad was like, it was freaking him out. And at one point I watched him turn to them and he said, hey, are you guys done with those pretzels? And they're like, uh-huh. I'm just being honest. And he did this like, so he picked up the bowl and he did this several times thereafter, and he unzipped his coat pocket and he turned the bowl into a funnel and he just dumped them into his pocket. And so then, like, both of my boys' eyes were like this big. They're just watching this thing going like, this is unbelievable. So then they started playing a joke on him. I think it might have been my idea, where they would purposely go get a bowl of food, and then they would only eat a few of them, and then they'd stick it under the chair in front of them, and he did not leave a single bowl empty the entire time. And then, this is the best part, was then we got home, and my oldest got home from a football game, and he walked in the door, and my dad goes, hey, Lincoln, you want some pretzels? So, like, that's a different level of hoarding, right? I mean, I grew up that way. If you got a bowl of soup at the restaurant and you got 3 packages of saltines with them and you only ate one, then you stick the other 2 in your wife's purse. The question is, though, like, does that break down the idea? And I think part of what we have to talk about is, like, well, sometimes we react to things and we deconstruct them, and sometimes we just adopt them, but stop and think about the way you go about marriage. And I think one of the scariest things about marriage is this question of, can you have a better marriage than you've observed in your life, that you've experienced, whether that's your own parents or your own family or some mentors. Think about the way you parent, and even though when the first was born, you swore you would never, and can you parent better than what you've watched other people do? I mean, we can all read the books, we can all do the Bible studies, but can we rise above what we've experienced relationally? Or think about the way you think about money, or what you drive, the way you practice your vocation. We're quickly reminded of our incredible need for relationships. And frankly, I think this is all over the text. I'm taking a class at Portland Seminary right now where I had no idea that the professor warned us at the beginning, like, this is the kind of class that could shipwreck your faith if you're not careful. And I was like, whatever. And I wouldn't say my faith is at all shipwrecked, but I could see how it could do that because the class is Israel in its ancient context. And so part of what we're studying is where did Israel come from? Which, of course, forces you to begin to ask questions of, like, when did humans come into existence, and when did Abraham, and what's the era of that? And what we see is that somewhere around 1500 BCE is what people would say in the early Bronze Age, or the late Bronze Age, rather. You've got Abraham, and then, oh wait, that's not accurate. Late Bronze Age would be Moses, some 400 or 500 years later. So we're asking these bigger questions about what's the culture that Israel came from, and what were the practices, and what were the beliefs, and what were the values, and how did God do this unique thing with these people, and why did God do it that way, and how was that story told? Well, part of what comes to the surface, and this is the uncomfortable part, is you begin to see that Israel came of age in a culture that was incredibly pluralistic. Some scholars say that just in the ancient Near East, or what we might call the Middle East, it's not exactly the same thing, but pretty close, that in 2000 BCE, that there was the belief in and worship of over 1,000 gods. And yet then we read about Israel, and we see this God calling them to worship this one God. And there's this tension of monotheism. In fact, we know now that other than Israel, unless some new culture is discovered, there was only one instance or even attempt at monotheism before Israel. There was a pharaoh in Egypt, I think it was in 1300 BC, who decided that he was going to, like, align things in such a way that only the sun god was worshipped. And it was a dismal failure, and when he died, so did the idea of monotheism. And what that means is then Israel is being called into something that, frankly, they have no teachers for. They have no models, no mentors for. It's why we say Israel was far more monolatrous in those early days than they were monotheists. And that's not to say that Jesus wasn't a monotheist, but it is to say that at least the initial ask was a God going, worship me and me alone. And these people who are struggling to do that. And I think when you begin to get for me, what's happened as I began to see all that is you begin to understand that the arc of the Hebrew Bible is in many ways a people called to something far more radical than any teacher could ever help them with outside of themselves. And there's these ebbs and these flows of these people departing from the Canaanite gods and then returning to, And even in archaeology, the different layers tell us how a particular season of Israelite history was doing based upon the presence of certain things. And then you start reading guys like Jeremiah, who was doing his work around the fall of Jerusalem. And if nothing else, I think there ought to be incredible empathy for how radical of a move and how difficult of a move this was for Israel. Listen to what Jeremiah says. He says, "My people, they've committed two sins. They've forsaken me, the spring of living water, and have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water." We've talked about this in the past because I think it's one of the most vibrant texts about what God is calling, because a spring, living water is a spring. And remember, Israel, part of the reason why they were able to hold the land in places like Jerusalem for as long as they did is because it was a horribly impractical place that most people didn't want, because it was mountainous and it was desert. They call it wilderness. And if you're going to survive, you've got to have water. So there were a fortunate few who put their tribe next to a natural spring, living water. Jesus uses this analogy for himself. It's reliable, it's clean, it's perpetual, it's cool, it's not filled with disease like a pond can be. But then he contrasts that with this idea of a cistern. And here's a couple pictures of a cistern. I think they're actually two different cisterns. If you ever go to Israel, sometimes you get cynical and go like, is this just a cistern tour? Because they're everywhere. The other way was that you would carve for yourself from the limestone basically a tribe-sized camelback, a water bottle. You would build it in a place where the rainwater and the few times a year that it rained would all kind of compile and converge, and it would fill up this cistern. And before that would have happened, you would have taken the time to line it with plaster. But of course, what can go wrong with that? Well, an animal can fall in there and die. Bacteria and other stuff can come to life. Worse still, what Jeremiah is talking about here is your cistern can crack, and suddenly you're a month or two removed from the rainy season, and only then do you realize that your water is going away at a rate faster than it ought to be, and it's going to be gone long before it rains again. And God is drawing this analogy of what I'm trying to do is invite you to live next to the spring. But you've exchanged that for these gods that can't help. Listen to the way Jeremiah continues. He says, "How can I say, I'm not defiled, I have not run after the Baals." That's one of the real dominant gods of the Canaanites that they were born into. "See how you behaved in the valley? Consider what you have done. You are a swift she-camel running here and there." Part of what I learned this week is that apparently a young camel, in our culture we might say it's like a Labrador retriever puppy or 8-year-old. That one of the idioms was that a young camel never takes 2 steps in the same direction. And remember, he's speaking to Israel here. Listen to this. This gets even more graphic. "A wild donkey accustomed to the desert, sniffing the wind in her craving. In her heat, who can restrain her? Any males that pursue her need not tire themselves. At mating time, they'll find her." What's he saying? He's saying, quite frankly, Israel, you're a whore. Like that you're just constantly running after. But my point would be this, that I wonder if there's value. First of all, one scary thing I think comes to the surface, and I think this gets back to why Jesus was so hard on leaders. Because it's this reminder that if it's true that we can only learn things in the context, or mostly only learn things in the context of relationship, then what importance does that put on parenting? What importance does that put on leaders? But I think there's also room for compassion, that this evolving idea that God was doing that gets us to Jesus was obviously therefore going to take some time, because this is radical. What if, and I don't know what the driving hurt or need is in your life, like if buying books and listening to podcasts hasn't solved it, what if the reality is it takes a relationship to do that? Now, here's where I want to try to weld together 2 different ideas, and and it's this question of what if disciples pick themselves? But to try to create a word picture, here's what I want to try to do is, because I was trying to think of like, what are these genius things that went together? And when I asked the staff, Hannah was sure, like, there's no better illustration than chocolate and peanut butter. Like, this thing that when combined. So I'm gonna throw these like the Candyman, okay? So watch out. Does anybody have a recent concussion? Lindsay's like, could you just throw the whole bag? So here we go. We do have insurance, but we would prefer that you not use it. Did I get one back there yet? Oh yeah, there we go. Anybody wounded yet? Oh, that's good. There's supposed to be 100. Ouch, sorry. It's all the more reason to sit in the balcony. I can't throw them to you guys. Todd's sitting back there going, I'm so glad I don't do your guys' business insurance. Okay, so I need someone to run these. Oh, you still need some? Okay. So here you go. I'm going to do this, Stacy, and then I'm going to throw you the bag, and you have to take them to the balcony. Ready? Stacy, Jeff, will you do that if I throw you these? Bam, thanks. So you got to take those up to you can't have them all. Oh, yeah, okay. Word pictures. So here we go. Nice catch. Sorry, Zach, I didn't bring anything that was vegan. That's my bad. Okay, so one day, I wasn't mocking you. I respect that. One day, Jesus was walking along, and as Jesus is walking along, this is early in Jesus' work. This is like he's graduated rabbi school, but he doesn't have any disciples yet. He's doing his thing, and he's walking along, and there's another rabbi of sorts. His name's John the Baptist, and John the Baptist has his cohort with him. And John looks out, and he sees Jesus walking, and he says, hey, you guys see that guy? And they're like, what guy? Which guy? And John's like, the guy in the white bathrobe with the blue Miss America sash with the wavy blonde hair, you see that guy? And they're like, yeah, we see him. And John says, like, I've taught you everything I know about God. That guy is God. Like, I've taught you everything that it looks like to follow God, but that guy's like living it out because he is God. Like, I've taught you everything I know about how to hit a fastball. That guy like invented the fastball. And two of John's followers, and I would love to know how many he had in total, because I think it makes its own point, but two of John's followers, one of them's name's Andrew and one of them's named John, they're actually like, well, check you later. I'm getting out of this school, and I'm going to go to that one. If it's the best, I'm going to that one. And they follow Jesus. And I think there's got to be some historical context here, but I haven't found it yet, because they're following Jesus like a stalker, and Jesus turns around at one point and is like, hey, what are you doing? And they say, and this is the absurd part, I'm like, there's got to be some context here. There's no way that this is here for no reasons, because it's the most odd question. They say, Rabbi, where are you staying? And he's like, well, come find out. And so they follow him. Now, what we don't know is what they talked about and where they went and how long they talked, and we don't know how many interactions they had with Jesus after that. What we know is in the Gospel of Matthew, there's another story. And in this story, Jesus is walking along the Sea of Galilee, which is confusing because it's not a sea, it's a lake. But he's walking along the Sea of Galilee, and he looks out and he sees what in their day was a commercial fishing vessel, and he sees Andrew, like one of the guys who followed him. And again, we don't know whether that was a year ago or 6 months ago or yesterday. We don't know whether there was the 100th interaction or the second. But Jesus looks out and he's like, hey, Andrew. And Andrew's like, Jesus. But he's not cussing. He's just like, Jesus. And Jesus says, come follow me. And Andrew's like, okay. And so he and his brother, who we know him as Peter, they're like, check you later, Pops. And they leave and they start following Jesus. And then Jesus keeps going. And again, we don't know the chronology of this, but he sees another fishing boat. And this time, John, one of those other guys who followed him back when they asked him where he was staying, John's in the boat. And he says, hey, John, you want to follow me? And John's like, heck yeah. And so he and his brother James, they dive out of the boat, or we don't actually told that, but they start following Jesus. Now, here's my question. Who chose who? Like, who picked who? Like, you sit down with the four of them, Andrew and Simon and James and John and Jesus, and you do that, like, this is the dinner for eight question, right? Like, how did you meet? You asked, and I get there's some theological categories and Arminianism and prevenient grace and Calvinism. I'm actually not interested in that. I'm just trying to ask the practical question. If you're being told that you need to make sense of where this relationship originated and who gets credit for it, how are you dividing the credit? 50-50? 60-40? My hope would be that at least we could agree it's not 100 on Jesus and 0 on them. The disciples picked, on some sense, themselves. Now, we focus on the story about Jesus calling them from the beach. We miss the story in John. Or think of Moses. Moses, the part of his story that I love is one that actually Stephen tells. In Acts chapter 7 in the New Testament, he's about to get killed, and he offers what the Jewish people call a midrash, which is his way of, he speaks deeper into the narrative than the book of Exodus actually does. In Jewish culture, that's called midrash, and evangelicalism, that's called heresy, and I suppose both have their place. But listen to this. It says, when Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his own people, the Israelites. He saw one of them being mistreated by an Egyptian, so he went to his defense and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. Now, here's part of what Stephen takes some liberty with. Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. The next day, now we're back in Exodus. The next day, Moses came upon two Israelites who were fighting. He tried to reconcile them by saying, "Men, who are your brothers? Or you are brothers. Why do you want to hurt each other?" But the man who was mistreating the other pushed Moses aside and said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" When Moses heard this, he fled to Midian, where he settled as a foreigner and had 2 sons. So Moses is this iconic story, and appropriately right next to Jesus, this very important story about a guy who saw a need. He was an Israelite. He was raised in Egypt. He decided he was going to do something about it. He failed miserably at it. He went and reinvented himself. He found a new country and a new land and a new vocation. And at 80 years old, 40 years after this failed attempt at a coup d'etat occurred, God shows up and says to Moses, "Hey, Moses, you wouldn't believe it, but Israel's asking for my help. And I'm going to help them. And I want you to come with me. Here's my question. Who chose who? Like, who picked who? You sit down with God and Moses and start going, okay, let's make sense of why did you get to be that person? How are you dividing the responsibility? 50-50, 60-40, 70-30. Again, I'm going to hope that at least we can agree it's not 100% on God unless we have a completely deterministic worldview. There's some mutual responsibility there. One other story, there's this time where Jesus he's in a small town, I believe in the Galilee. And the tradition then was that if some important religious people were having dinner, especially because those were generally outside in a courtyard because it's hot and muggy there, that the townspeople could stand around and listen, not unlike, say, a city council meeting in our context. And they're having this meal, and the guys don't really like Jesus, but out of nowhere comes this woman who it's her right to be there. And it would sure seem like, based upon the way Luke tells the story, she was the town prostitute. Now, one of the dangerous things about this is how do you become a prostitute? And we don't know how she became one. We know that probably in descending order, what's most likely? Most likely would have been that she was married and then at some point was cast off by her husband. And as a now once married person in this culture, had a really difficult time finding a husband, and therefore she had to take it upon herself to get the only job that most women could get, and that was become a prostitute. The other option is that she was perhaps like sexually abused or something in those ramifications, and she had never been married. The third and probably least likely option is that she was such a scandalous rebel that she decided she was going to become a prostitute at a young age. You have to wonder, as she steps into this group, like whether her ex-husband is actually in the room, and how many points or how many appointments within her iPhone are represented by people in the circle. But all the same, she approaches Jesus with this expensive bottle of perfume and pours it all over his body. Now, question: what's going on there? Like, what's the value of perfume to a prostitute? And by dumping her best stuff on Jesus, what is she communicating about dependence and reliability and trust? Now, those that are there, they're beside themselves, they're irate, they can't believe Jesus is letting this go on. This could be so easily misunderstood. And Jesus picks up on that, in my opinion, not because he's God and he's reading their mind, but because he had advanced emotional and social intelligence, and he could kind of see what was going on, and he called them on it. He began to ask some questions, he told a story, he put them what we would call firmly in their place. Listen to the way he addresses her at the end of the story. Jesus said to the woman, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace." Again, here's my question. Who picked who? Who chose who? You sit down with Jesus and this woman and you go, boy, Jesus changed your life and hopefully the entire trajectory changed. Where are you giving the responsibility? 50-50, 60-40? And at what level can we agree, like, okay, despite theological constructs that make this complicated, she gets credit for some of that effort? What if disciples pick themselves? Here's where I first learned this, is with my friend Fred, who was a mentor to me for a very long time before I moved here. There was a point at which, and I don't remember when it was, where I just said thanks. Like, Gee, thanks, Fred. And he looked at me and he said, Adam, disciples pick themselves. I was like, what do you mean by that? And he said, and I think he's giving me too much credit, so please don't take this to the extreme, but he said, Adam, when we met, like you wanted something. There was things you wanted to learn. There was a person you wanted to be, that there was a God you wanted to follow. And then he said this, if you wouldn't have found me, you would have found somebody else. Now, I'm not convinced that's 100% true, or at least to the degree to which he's trivializing the unique role he played. But his point stands, doesn't it? In a community of people that so value learning, and that's part of what I think makes us, and the podcasts you listen to, and the books you read, and the therapists you see, and all the work that you do, what if there's a point at which we recognize some of the best teachers in our midst, it's not their job, and they don't have a degree in it, they're just like really good at marriage. And we can read books, and there's nothing wrong with that, and we can go to seminars, and there's nothing wrong with that, or we could just go like, man, you guys have an amazing marriage. Could we buy you dinner once a month and just pick your brain? You know, Marla, who many of you will know, who's led the creative production and the tech team for a bit now, she's transitioning out, and we're sad about that, and yet highly encouraged by the quality of candidates that have already kind of are throwing their name in for that. But I said to her last week, because part of what's happened is since she announced that she was transitioning after the Christmas Eve gathering, the number of emails and comments that I've received about like how much respect people have for her and Bob as parents, I've genuinely lost track of it. I don't know who it was, so don't overthink this if it was you, because it's all a blur to me. But I said to her last week, I said, as I was kind of trying to process this content with her, I said, Marla, how many people in the last couple of weeks have, or ever, have asked you and Bob to like just, can we buy you a pizza? Can we meet you for a beverage? And can we just ask you some questions about parenting? And she's like, nobody. Now, I'm not trying to say that to shame you or anybody else. It's not a bony finger thing. It's an invitation thing. What happens when we take these two ideas, and that is to really change, we need relationships to model that for us, if not invent the wheel in front of us, or at least helping us invent our own. And we're surrounded by people. And the point isn't, you might not have to become someone's formal, you might not need a mentor, the single person who you have dinner with 50 times. In reality, those people that you respect as parents, you might only have to buy them dinner twice. They might not have as many good ideas as you think. But what happens if we take those two concepts and marry them? We need people, and disciples pick themselves. And not every expert has to be one from the academic sense. You know, when you think about it, and we work hard on this around here, this idea that we're not better, and to not create this dualistic kind of reality and posture towards the world. We're frankly not trying to rescue people to Christian subculture or anything else. Like there's high respect for people outside of what we believe even. And yet if you think about it, the situation you and I are in, especially if you're someone actively trying to follow Jesus, it's not actually that much different than the Israelites. Like the average way the average person is engaging their iPhone is exponentially different perhaps than the one that you feel like would be healthy for you. Perhaps the average way that the average person's raising kids or the values that they're projecting onto them, it's different. And again, that's dangerous territory, and I don't want to spend very much time there, but what if we're actually all not all that much different than the Israelites? We need to find healthy people if we're actually going to step into this faith tradition and this person of God that we're trying to follow. I think Andy says it really well in the video when she just said, sometimes you just got to go get it, and she's modeled that as well as anybody. One last story, I was talking to a friend recently, and I asked him, I said, man, you guys are really connected, and you came here from out of town, and you had a lot of the same variables that lots of us do. I said, how did you get so connected? And he said, it was easy. He said, we looked for people who had kids, our kids' age and Narrate kids, and then we invited them over for dinner, and then we weeded out the weird ones. What if that's the invitation? So let me pray, and we're going to sing one more song. God, thanks, Lord, that you made us for relationship, even though relationships are a lot of work. Thanks, God, that you embed your truth and your beauty into people, but it tends to not be concentrated into one person, that we all have strengths and weaknesses, and that we can help one another round off the corners of our brokenness and our desire. So Jesus, I pray over this place that we would be active learners, not just in the sense of books and podcasts and therapists, but in the sense of relationship, that we would be intentional question askers when we're standing next to or walking alongside someone with whom we've observed does some things in some pretty profound ways. We love you, God. Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.